To support a culture, nothing less than a new philosophical foundation will do. The present state of the world is not the proof of philosophy's impotence, but the proof of philosophy's power. It is philosophy that has brought men to this state. It is only philosophy that can lead them out. That is a controversial claim from Ayn Rand in her essay For the New Intellectual. In the sense that she means this, I agree. No group of people will create a kind of world that is livable across the long range without first being committed to proper methods of thought and a proper philosophy. Welcome to week 24 of the Objectivism book study. We are in chapter 7 of Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand. It is pages 259 to 276. Today we're looking at Ayn Rand's understanding of the virtues of integrity and honesty. These, along with the other virtues that Ayn Rand names, tend to be missing from our society and even from our churches in exactly the kind of way that would in logic lead to the kind of situation that the world is descended into today. Ayn Rand understands integrity as being loyalty to rational principles. She understands honesty as the rejection of unreality. So integrity is a consistency within your own thinking, within your own character, your soul, your choices. Honesty is matching your choices and beliefs to external reality, being consistent with reality, and rejecting that which contradicts reality. So both of these virtues are similar. They both pertain to consistency. And so when I first heard integrity and honesty listed as two different things, I thought, aren't they just overly similar? But let's find out. So let's take a look in the book, starting on page 259. Peikoff writes, integrity as loyalty to rational principles. He calls integrity loyalty in action. He says this virtue is one's recognition of the fact that man is an integrated being. So etymologically, there's a connection there between being an integrated being, no breach between your body and your mind, between your action and your thought, between your life and your convictions. So staying true to that which you have concluded, that's integrity. On the next page, we read that on the conceptual level, the consequences of flouting one's knowledge are not inescapable. To keep one's value judgments operative amid the vicissitudes of life is a volitional task. Therefore, it's within the realm of what we'd consider normative, the realm of choices and virtues that we have to follow by choice. It requires that one act in focus, holding the full context of one's knowledge and retaining the perspective of long-range purpose. Context of this kind can be held and long-range purpose achieved only if man functions by the guidance of principles. So part of what he's talking about here with integrity is it's the principle of being principled. Part one of the principles that you must identify in order to flourish is the need for principles in the first place. So this is a sort of a meta-level principle. Peikoff writes, integrity is the virtue of acting as an absolute on rational principle. It is the principle of being principled. Middle of the page, it is the policy of practicing what one preaches, regardless of emotional or social pressure. It is the policy of not allowing any consideration whatever to overwhelm the conclusions of one's mind, neither in one's feelings or maybe the feelings of others. So whatever it is that your mind has come to the conclusion of, you must act in consistency with your conclusion. That's integrity. Peikoff writes, it is a breach of integrity if you know that you're right, but then you proceed, usually with some rationalizations, to defy whatever is right in practice. And to do this, a person must willfully brush aside his knowledge. He must blind himself to whatever he already sees and pretend that he does not think what he knows he does. And this is what Ayn Rand calls faking one's consciousness. You can see that this is connected to the vice of evasion, the opposite of rationality, irrationality. Clearly, this is related to that overall category of are you reality-oriented or are you not? Peikoff writes, knowledge may not properly be evaded when the time comes to act. Now, top of page 261, integrity requires that a man have convictions. You couldn't have integrity at all if you didn't already have ideas, if you didn't already have some convictions. So this is the virtue of being consistent with your principles. Middle of that page, integrity means loyalty not to a whim or delusion, but to one's knowledge. So you cannot speak of some moral monster as having integrity with their evil principles, because we need correct principles, and integrity pertains to having correct principles and staying loyal to those. If what the person has is not knowledge, like say somebody wants to commit genocide, and they know that their own group of people is the only good people in the world, that's not knowledge. They think they know it, but they don't know it. So it's not really integrity. We can't really praise them for having integrity. He says, like every other virtue, integrity presupposes a mind that seeks knowledge, a mind that accepts and follows reason. Now, you might have temptation sometimes, even if you're a person of integrity, to embrace an out-of-context emotion. And Peikoff writes, this is not immoral in itself. This is consistent with Christianity. To think about doing something bad is not itself always immoral. It may not be. And so you could have an out-of-context emotion that's no way immoral, so long as the individual does not act on the emotion, but looks at reality and summons the full context of consciousness, thereby reclaiming his knowledge of the action's harmful consequences. So we think consequentially. And once you begin to do that, once you realize, like the proverb says, the effect of sin, then you realize you don't want to throw fire on your lap. And that's integrity. Realizing that you actually do believe something, you actually do hold principles, and then acting consistently with them rather than being weak and self-contradictory. Don't be weak and self-contradictory. In other words, stand up. Hold up, like a building that stands up even if there's an earthquake. The building that stands up in an earthquake has internal integrity. And that is what we're talking about. Okay, any comments about any of that? And then I'll keep going forward in the book.
A lot of people, when we talk about someone on the left who's extreme, you say, well, hey, I got to hand it to them. At least they're consistent. At least they're taking that idea consistently. We shouldn't grant them that. I do wonder what Peikoff would say when we say, well, hey, at least Alexandria Cortez at least she has integrity about being a socialist.
Yeah, I'd avoid calling AOC somebody of integrity, because integrity suggests a combination of internal consistency, but also consistency with actual principles. And taking whatever your group says and just spitting it out every day and doing that consistently, you could say that that's consistent. There's not a moral principle behind it. That's the problem with it. If you were looking for that one word, maybe principled. A principled person is a person of integrity. And I can't say that AOC is principled. Is it fair to say that somebody is principled if they are a Democrat? I just would not use that term, principled. I might say that they are consistent in their pursuit of wickedness, but I wouldn't say they're principled. That would suggest that I'm saying that they're morally good in some way. And there's nothing morally good about being consistently bad.
Yeah, and we also know that from other Ayn Rand writings and from the Bible that it's the evil that needs the good. It's not the good that needs the evil. So there is an asymmetry in your ability to use that concept of consistency.
That's a really important point that you raised, that the evil needs the good. The evil takes something that's good and twists it and contradicts it partly, but not completely. If it completely twisted it, you'd actually destroy yourself. You couldn't do it. That asymmetry helps us understand why some of these terms can only apply to one side and not the other.
True consistent evil would just be like a pile of ash and rubble.
These topics, looking at the individual virtues from Rand's point of view, this is a lot easier than looking at Rand's epistemology, or even looking at her foundations for ethics, the axiology that we've been discussing the last few weeks. It's really coasting from here. Everything that we do here is the payoff, and it's going to be, I think, fairly easy for us as Christians to see what we can take from this as valuable. So I'm looking forward to this as we talk through these individual virtues and the applications to politics. It's going to be so much easier now that we've done all that hard work. We're in the bottom of 261. For Objectivism, moral evil is the spiritual equivalent of poison. So this is what Andrew was pointing out. There is no element of soul or body urging men to succumb to such a thing. There is no inbuilt attraction to falsehood, brainlessness, or suicide. The challenge of a man's life is not to struggle against immoral passions, but to see the facts of reality clearly in full focus. Once a man has done this in a given situation, there is no further difficulty in regard to him acting on what he sees. When integrity is a matter of self-preservation, its practice comes to seem irresistible. So if we realize the need for principles, then it's very natural for us to be motivated to follow them. If you think about what the Proverbs do, it says, listen, my son, you need to learn wisdom. Once you realize what wisdom is and the role that it has in your life, once the son realizes that, he will have a motivation and a hunger for it. Once you have this perspective on what principles are, it's not any difficulty to want to stay loyal to them. She says, I am not brave enough to be a coward. I see the consequences too clearly. It's a very natural, reasonable progression from this is true to I'm going to continue affirming it and be principled about it. Next section, if one's moral principles are irrational, that's not going to happen. And this accounts for a lot of the confusion we see in the world today. If somebody thinks that you really can't connect logically from what is to what ought to be, if you think that moral principles cannot be grounded, if you think they're irrational, well, then you're going to reach this conclusion that integrity is chimerical. So this is a point that is illustrated through the centuries by religious philosophers. In their view, a person may know full well what is right and good, but he will nevertheless be seduced by evil. You will be seduced not just occasionally, owing to some temporary error, but ceaselessly, inescapably by virtue of the lower elements in his nature which are only human. This week I watched a film by Ridley Scott. It was called The Last Duel, and one of the characters in the story makes a choice, and then after that he regrets the choice, and he says, I couldn't help myself. He's coming at it from this medieval religious philosophy, and he goes and confesses to the Catholic priest. He says, forgive me, I've sinned. He just thinks it's a normal part of life that these kinds of things would happen, and he would then say, I can't help myself. That's because he has embraced this idea that principles are chimerical, that principles are not really demonstrable and rational. And so he feels that for him to be consistent with one part of his character and his desires, that therefore he has to do things that are publicly known to be immoral. It's like he's split, because to be true to himself in one way means being false to himself in a different way. That's what we've seen throughout history. That's the consequences. And then Peikoff mentions this lament of Paul. I do not understand what I'm doing. I can will, but I cannot do what is right. I do not do the good things that I want to do. I do the wrong things that I do not want to do. What a wretched man I am. Now that seems to have some parallels to what was being described above, but I don't think that that's a good application. I just don't think it's a good reading of Paul. Because what Paul is pointing out is that we still have inclinations toward evil. And that is true. We do have inclinations toward evil. But what Paul is saying is not that the good cannot be demonstrated rationally. That's not Paul's perspective. What Paul is pointing out is that we have a natural inclination toward sin, and that when we gain the mind of Christ, then we can look at that natural inclination. We have the mind of Christ. We have a rational basis. We are transformed in our character. We can look at that old nature, and we can say that's death, and that's not something that I love. But nevertheless, there is a warring element within us. Now that is true theologically. It's true from what Scripture teaches, but it's also true observationally, that we do have warring desires from time to time. But I would argue that this warring desire, like for example, if you're a man and you're married and you see a beautiful woman walking down the street and you think, there is a beautiful woman, I want to look at her, then you have to make a decision at that point. Am I going to look at her with lust in my heart, which Jesus condemned? Is Jesus being rational? Or is Jesus being irrational and I'm being rational? You're going to have to make a decision about that. You have to note to yourself, I am desiring something out of context. I am being irrational. You have to have the ability to say that. And that's what Paul's talking about.
I was thinking of the time that it might have been Ben Shapiro debating Yaron Brook. And Ben Shapiro said, reason is good, but we shouldn't be hyper rational all the time, because reason would say, well, let me leave my wife and kids and go with this super beautiful younger woman. You and Jacob pointed out, wait a second. You don't really think that's the true rational choice, do you? That that's really what's better for you. And I think that's an illustration of this issue here. I do think it's good to talk about a little bit more. Why is Peikoff getting Paul wrong here? Because it'll be easy to lob the charge at us who are appreciating a lot of this chapter that the natural conclusion of what we're talking about is that Paul would be wrong. And I was thinking as you were talking, Cody, that you could paint the picture of the difference between Paul's sort of sense of life and the medieval sense of life, where the medieval person says the sin that I'm tempted to do really would be good for my fleshly self, but I'm supposed to be good to my spiritual self, which is completely divorced. Whereas Paul is saying, it's because I haven't fully been conformed to the, like you said, the mind of Christ yet. It's only because I'm blinded by sin that I am deceived into thinking that this thing would be good for me, that I want this sinful thing. I think there's been some really interesting posts recently from Dr. Ona Anderson, who's been talking about how a lot of times sin is culpable ignorance. It's because we don't really taste and see clearly the goodness of what is good for us. And I think about when John said, when he appears, we will be like him because we will see him. When we fully see, when we fully are brought into an understanding of what's good, I think the Bible's teaching is that the fleeting pleasures of sin will look like nothing. And I think that's what the authors of Proverbs were trying to get their audience to understand. My baby agrees clearly.
Well said. The section here is leading up to this point that I want to make about the difference between rational Christianity for those who love their lives versus the kind of Christianity that is very often upheld by religious leaders today. So we can agree with Peikoff's overall position on these issues, that it is rational to have principles and to follow them. You compare that to what he says in this next section. If one demands of man obedience to duty, and he means like blind duty, just so stories, the rejection of pleasure, the practice of sacrifice, then of course men will be assaulted by temptation. The temptation inherent not in any lower nature, but in the vital requirements of a rational being, to seek values, to pursue happiness, to achieve their own welfare. Now we see this within Big Eva, within evangelical mainstream teaching a lot, this preaching of death to self, which is a phrase that's not in the Bible. And if you hear it preached, death to self, to your own desires, we just need to be selflessly serving other people. And let's say you made a career, 20 or 30 years of selflessly spending your time on the priorities of other people and the needs of other people. In your mind, you're going to know that there's something going on here that is not the way that you ought to be living. You're going to know, in terms of how you understand what you're doing, there's a problem. Now, I'm not saying that serving other people is a problem, but I agree with the missionaries when they say it wasn't really a sacrifice. There was a joy in this. And it's because of this moral teaching, you ought to be self-sacrificing for its own sake. That what happens is you end up doing the things that really are good, that you really should do, but you do them without understanding how they're good to you, without looking at how they're good to you. And if you do that over time long enough, then your soul begins to become desperate for values. And this happens to pastors. So just a couple weeks back, I made this Facebook post. By my count, at least 7 or 8 of the most recent 11 SBC presidents have now been involved in public scandals, so bad that if the reports are true, they should never again be trusted in church leadership roles. Some of these, not all of them, relate to sexual misconduct. Now, what does that tell you about a religious group if you have that many scandals going on? We don't have to list them all here, but we're talking just about having an affair with someone else's wife. We're talking about cover-ups, person after person. I want to highlight something about such men, something that most people would never notice. The Christian leaders who speak loudest about selflessness tend at some point in life to simply crumble. And they begin a pattern of entertaining out-of-context sexual desires, leading to inappropriate and immoral actions. And the behaviors are completely pathetic. Trying to seduce someone in the most awkward way that shows that you have no idea even like how to get somebody to fall in love with you. It's just forcing yourself on somebody else or trying to use your position of authority as a crutch to impress somebody. Should you be surprised if these men who celebrate selflessness and they try to live in a way that's completely other-centered become frustrated and unstable? They do not have a philosophy for living on earth. And so they become self-tortured neurotics. And finally, one day they snap. And immediately they get their hands caught in the cookie jar. By the way, if you look at the people that this happens to, look at their public statements about what kind of life they try to live and what they believe in. And you'll hear them saying things like they want to live selflessly, that they've dedicated their ministry alongside other selfless men and women. They really just preach selflessness left and right. Like that's the first thing that you see if you read anything that they've said. So I want to ask you, if somebody did take selflessness seriously as an ideal, why would they care about protecting their own character? Why would they care about protecting their own soul? Why would they care about protecting their own legacy? Why wouldn't they morally crumble? I mean, after all, they accepted a moral code that defined themselves as the essence of evil. Maybe one day they actually just believed it. Maybe one day they actually believed that the needs of others are an obligation and that their own self is not valuable. And then they became desperate for something that would be a band-aid on the pain that that causes. That's my theory about why these people do these things. What if the common cause of our leaders' failure is not only that they are fallible men, but more specifically that they are fallible men trying to operate on a set of moral premises that are exactly suited only to one purpose, and that is to make a man hate his own life. And I think that's what you see in these people.
It would follow, based on Paul's reasoning in Ephesians, that a man does not hate his own body, but he cherishes it. And so that's how you love your wife. The inverse of that would have to be true as well. And that might be some of what you're seeing go on. I once upon a time, was at a Bible study with several older men who were all married. And one of them said, how long have you been married? And the other person said, X number of years. And he said, oh, you're that many years into your probation. Those kind of jokes like, oh, I'm shackled up to my wife. And then everyone had a good laugh and said, oh, no, really, my wife is the one who suffers, and I don't know why she ever married me. And I was sitting here wondering, do you see a connection between the fact that you're joking about being like enslaved to your wife and then turning around and saying, my poor wife, I'm the worst thing that's in her life, and I'm lucky to have her. I wanted to say, do you not realize that you are despising and resenting? I know they were joking, but there's a hint of, why would that even be funny if there wasn't a little bit of truth in how they felt? And it's almost like it comes out of like, we have to do this whole marriage thing. We just have to do it. And neither of us want to. But that's the beauty of it in their mind.
It's proof of their duty-based life. It's like they're doing time, and they think that that's their virtue. I can't even imagine. Like, I would never joke about how bad marriage is. It's not. It's the best thing in my life. Why would the thought even cross my mind? Andrew, when you saw my Facebook post about these Southern Baptist leaders, you made this well thought out Bible study comment. And you said, consider chapter 5 through 7 in the Proverbs and the exhortations to sexual purity. And so if Solomon's son were to ask him why, what would be the answer? Well, because we need to be selfless, because we need to sacrifice our life for the sake of self-sacrifice for its own sake. You wrote, let's look at the rewards for chastity and the consequences threatened for lust and adultery. And you said, look, 5:2, 5:9, 5:17, 5:18. It says, keep discretion, guard knowledge, keep your honor, enjoy flowing water from your wife to the exclusion of other men, rejoice in your wife. And it goes on, delight in her physical form to the point of being intoxicated. Preserve yourself, live. If you don't follow these principles, then you're going to taste bitterness, be cut by a sword, you're going to die, lose your honor, lose your years. Watch your fruit be enjoyed by someone else. Groan when your flesh is consumed. And it just goes on, like all the different lists of ways that you could destroy yourself. Be hunted down, burned, scorched, punished, destroyed, wounded. It's so clear that sin is stupid. Sin is stupid. Why don't we hear pastors just talking about that?
How could that not fuel you to live for Christ? What doesn't fuel you is what you've been talking about up until this point.
You also pointed out in 1 Corinthians 6:18, there's a special exhortation against sexual sin because it's against your own body. Notice the rational self-interest inherent. It's assumed by such a thing. Paul just assumes that his readers will know. If it's a sin against your own body, that means it's extra obviously bad and stupid. In this section, we're on 262. Peikoff writes, if people believe that such concerns are vices, then the practice of integrity is not only impossible to them, but a threat. To the extent that they enact their preachments, their survival is imperiled. Hence the mystic's unfailing claim that because of practical and earthly or bodily considerations, moral perfection is unattainable. So it is if perfection is defined by intrinsicist dogmas. To irrational principles, one cannot be loyal. Ideas that are not derived from reality cannot be consistently practiced in reality. At the bottom of this page, he says that, a man, if he's not willing to bargain about morality, then he's principled. I'm not willing to bargain about it. There is no question about whether or not I'm going to follow my principles. And that is somebody who is an extremist. He rejects the idea of compromise as sort of like an end in itself, sort of like a standard or a value. So Peikoff discusses compromise here. And he says that a compromise, there's a good kind and a bad kind. So just the definition of it is a adjustment of conflicting claims by mutual concessions. And he says, so you have to ask yourself, what kind of concessions are we making here? Is it a concession of the specific price of a good, or is it a concession of a moral principle? If it's a concession of a moral principle, then that is an immoral kind of compromise. So he gives this example of dealing with a burglar. If the burglar wants to steal everything and you want him to steal only half of it, that would be an immoral compromise because you've just compromised the principle that you own your property. I would compare this also to the income tax, by the way. I'd say that when the United States accepted the idea of a 1% income tax on the 1% most wealthy, or whatever they did back around World War I, once they accepted that principle, then it was only a matter of increasing the amount of moral concessions. The moral principle was already breached. That's why I celebrate the Founding Fathers, because they realized with the stamp tax and with the tea tax and those different things, wait a minute, we can't even concede just a 1% tax here. That's a moral principle thing. And they were willing to fight over a moral principle. Next section, he says there is no longer any way to stop somebody when they come back tomorrow for more loot. I used to be a school teacher, and I remember one time one of the students comes up to me and he says, hey, Mr. Livable, I need $1. I really need $1 right now. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, this is the first time this has ever happened. If I give him $1, that's going to get around. And I'm going to be asked for money from everyone. The superintendent, the school is going to be like, what in the world are you doing? And so, my response to him was, oh, you know what? I can totally relate. I really need $1 too. Could I have one from you? And as soon as I turned it around on him, then he's like, oh, never mind. I don't like this game anymore. Because anybody can just arbitrarily make requests under these rules. Think in terms of principles. There was another story that was very similar to that. Charles Lindbergh, when he was about to fly over the Atlantic Ocean, he was asked, hey, could I give you like $1,000 and you can take this letter and deliver it for me? And now the letter was not going to increase the chances of him succeeding in his mission. It was just $1,000 for a letter. And he thought to himself, if I say yes, then at what point am I going to start saying no? What if I end up getting like thousands and thousands of dollars worth of letters and it's this huge bag that weighs like 100 pounds and all of a sudden I don't make it across the ocean? So he said, I'm just going to say no. That was his choice. Thinking ahead, that's being principled. I don't know that that was the right choice because it's always, in that case, it was a matter of risk and reward and contingencies, but that's how he thought about it. Bottom of 263, a country able to defend itself, which decides nevertheless to negotiate with its aggressor, that would be being unprincipled. Now, I don't blame Ukraine for wanting to negotiate with Russia because they don't have the ability to defend themselves. But if the United States were negotiating with Russia, we have a problem. If Russia is making threats against the United States, or if some other country, some other small, like tin can dictatorship were to make threats against the United States, we need to not negotiate with them. It would be immoral to do so. It would be a compromise of principle, and the principle is that we have the right to our own lives. By conceding the propriety of some aggression, it has dropped the principle of self-defense and its own sovereignty. And that's what we saw in the previous examples from way back in the book when we talked about Neville Chamberlain conceding the right of Hitler to take some property. All right, let's go to 264. As a last example, consider a judge. And he talks about how if you occasionally compromise on justice, if you occasionally play favorites as a judge, then there really is no principle at play anymore other than favoritism. Because what's going to decide whether it's going to be favoritism or not? It's the principle of favoritism. Justice cannot countenance a single act of injustice. What sets the terms of this judge's compromise is favoritism. So in the bottom of this page, we read, the attempt to reach a compromise between reason and emotionalism means the rejection of reason and the enshrinement of emotionalism. You cannot compromise reason. Once you've compromised it a little, you've compromised it all the way. One accepts a rational principle either as an absolute or not at all. He compares it to Faust. Once you make a bargain with the devil, you're in trouble. And Rand points out, in any compromise between food and poison, it is only death that can win. In any compromise between good and evil, it is only evil that can profit. The reason for this is not that evil is more powerful. Again, this kind of touches on what Andrew was saying. It's not that evil is more powerful. On the contrary, evil is powerless, and it can only exist as a parasite on the good. The good is the rational. It is that which conforms to the facts of reality and thereby fosters man's life. It acquires no advantages from its antithesis. That's the asymmetry in the battle between good and evil. The good does not need the evil. The evil does need some good to be a parasite. By its very nature, Peikoff writes, the good can only lose by trafficking with the evil. That's my explanation for why I don't think it's a good idea to be in an association, like in the Southern Baptist Convention, an association that is led by dishonorable men who are not in agreement with what the Bible says and who will try to discredit you while taking your money. Why would you be in an association with such men? The evil is in the opposite position, and I think that if those who say that we should stay within the SBC would look at that fact, that the evil is in the opposite position, they would understand what the SBC actually is. The SBC is a system of injustice. The SBC is a system in which the conservatives pay in and liberal professors get paid out. The liberal professors go and make more people like them. The liberals and the moderates within the SBC are parasites on the conservatives. That's why they want, quote, unity. Evil cannot be upheld as an absolute or practiced without contradiction. Within the SBC, liberals don't fund things. Liberals don't donate. Conservatives donate because they actually believe what the Bible says. Conservatives are going to donate to the SBC The liberals aren't, but the liberals get the benefit. And that is why you must separate yourself, and you must not cooperate and seek unity with them. 266, he talks about this mentality of the person that wants to be the boss or the slave driver. He says the boss mentality counts on the appearance of justice so that men will respect the courts. And then when the boss wishes it, he can intervene behind the scenes and cash in. That's what kind of system that most governments are. Sort of a system of pretend justice just for the sake of appearances so that the people will be pacified.
This is the reason why integrity has to be 100%. Because if you say, I will have integrity except here, then whatever causes you to do that, that is your highest principle.
Exactly.
You can't have a highest principle that can sometimes change.
For sure. Now, he writes, evil is not consistent, does not want to be consistent. What it wants is to inject itself into the life-sustaining process, sometimes short range, out of context at whim. And all it needs is a single concession from the good to do that. Just the concession of, yeah, evil is okay sometimes. And that's how evil survives, is when the good says, okay, sometimes a little bit. Now, the power of the good is enormous, Peikoff writes, but it depends on its consistency. That's why it has to be an issue. The good has to be an issue of all or nothing, black or white. That's why evil has to be partial or gray or occasional. Just like he points out, 1 or 2 really big lies, that makes you a liar. If you kill just 1 or 2 of people, that makes you a murderer. That's how we use these terms, and there's a reason for that. To be evil only sometimes is to be evil. To be a liar or a killer only sometimes is to be a liar or a killer. Now, at the top of 267, he talks about the cult of compromise in today's political system. We call it the mixed economy, a mix between free market principles versus socialism or welfare statism. Now, this cult of compromise, this comes from a society that is skeptical about truth claims. It's on this foundation of skepticism that we have this conclusion that, well, we don't really know, so let's just mix. Probably the truth is in the middle somewhere. The man who says, who am I to know, can hardly be loyal to the knowledge that he denies having. So now he points out the pragmatists, the agnostics, the relativists. All these people, they're incapable of standing up for what's right. And that explains the state of our country today. Because different people are agnostic or relativist or pragmatist or compromisers. They worship compromise. They deny system building. They just want to know what works by whatever standard. He says, since the skeptics stand for nothing in theory, they can stand by nothing in practice. So thus we see the connection between Ayn Rand's political theory and her epistemology. That accounts for the state of the United States. We go on in the bottom of this page to the topic of honesty. We've seen what integrity is, commitment to being principled. That is consistency internally. Now, honesty is the commitment to consistency with the facts of reality. So it's consistency between yourself and other things. But so they're both issues of consistency, but we understand honesty as the refusal to fake reality, to pretend that the facts are other than they are. Whereas with integrity, you cannot break your own commitments. With honesty, you cannot fake reality. Face the truth on every issue, writes Peikoff. The truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. So he writes, if rationality, as we may say, is the commitment to reality, then honesty is its obverse. It's the rejection of unreality. Honesty, therefore, relates to rationality. It's just the rejection of the irrational. That's honesty. And why? Well, because only existence exists. The man who traffics in unreality, seeking to make it his ally, is making reality his enemy. The first step of faking like a man's first act of evasion leads to the next. It becomes a time bomb. Remember, this is in Rand's words, the unreal is unreal and can have no value. Neither love nor fame nor cash is a value if obtained by fraud. According to Ayn Rand's theory of value, remember that value comes within a context. You cannot just say that, say, $1 million worth of gold is a value intrinsically. It's only a value within a certain context for a certain person to be able to be used for a certain thing. And so if you had to kill a whole bunch of people in order to get $1 million worth of gold, that's not the same in your life as if you had earned it. Having that gold is not the same. If you had to lie about where the money came from, and about who you are in order to use that money and succeed in buying the things that you need, that would be a different thing than if you didn't have to lie. And so we have to be careful not to set ourselves up so that lies are our means of living. And Peikoff has this whole discussion about how if you did set it up so that lies were your means of living, you'd be in trouble, because then you are subordinating yourself to the deception of others. You can only survive by being surrounded by people who are not smart enough to know that you're deceiving them. This is not a favorable condition for living. I think that within Christianity, it's very easy to understand the need for honesty, the need for seeking the truth. Christianity is very strong and clear on this issue. There's nothing here that I'm particularly surprised by as I read it. But Peikoff writes, the satisfaction of a desire is not necessarily a value, it may be a disvalue. So desire is not the same as value. The correct assessment follows from the relationship between the desire and man's life. If you desire to kill somebody and take their stuff, that desire does not align with the needs of human life. The man who seeks to obtain a value by faking is going to implicitly raise whatever value it is that he's trying to steal above that which exists. That's going to create a contradiction. Top of 269, since a man lives in reality, he must conform to reality. Peikoff writes, in regard to consciousness, honesty consists of taking the process of cognition seriously. So you reject intellectual pretense. Now, in the method, that means that you're going to have an active mind. You're going to know what you're dealing with, expand your knowledge, never evade, never accept a contradiction. This is internally. There's a need for internal commitment to honesty, not just in how you deal with other people. Top of 270, it's not just like don't lie to your neighbors. It means that you must become a priest of the truth in every aspect of your mind, your life, and your soul. The ministry of R.C. Sproul would often refer to the sanctity of truth. And this is something that's lacking within other ways of approaching Christian teaching, like, for example, the presuppositional apologetics and epistemology approach. The sanctity of truth, we seek the truth wherever it is to be found. We are committed to a method and a process of seeking to find the truth. We are not committed to this assumption that we already have the truth, we already know what it is, and that from there we're going to build everything. Rather, we are committed to the fact that there is such a thing as truth and that we must apprehend it by a method. And with that commitment, then you're able to be an honest person. Without that commitment, you're not an honest person. Even if you're saying true things, if you didn't reach it by a method that was reality-oriented, what claim do you have to being honest? You're just telling just so stories. When I look at R.C. Sproul's vision for the sanctity of truth, I think, yes, I want to be a priest, like Peikoff says, a priest of the truth in every aspect of my life. And that is why I disagree with presuppositionalism and say this viewpoint, this kind of approach to truth prevents you from being an honest priest of the truth. That has consequences on everything, not just on how you argue with an unbeliever. It has consequences on your character when you decide that you're going to let yourself do this. Peikoff writes, turning now to honesty in action. Okay, so we got the idea of why I should be honest within myself. But why not just execute a well-planned swindle? Like he says, let's sell stock in a fake gold mine and let's fraud a whole bunch of people, defraud them. He points out if you started a new life with the money that you got, you're going to have to lie to the new people. If you get married, you're going to have to lie to your wife about where the money came from. If you buy stuff, you're lying to the people about where your money came from. You're operating on a subhuman level, like an animal, and that is not a value for a human being. On 271, reality is a unity. If you depart from it at a single point, you basically are playing with a lighted fuse, and the bomb may not go off. You may get away with it. But what you're not getting away with is the fact that you've embraced a policy that ultimately, if you continued following such a policy, it would lead to destruction. And even as you embrace it once, your mind knows that you have done so. Your mind knows that you've now made the kind of decision that is unworthy of a human being. And so you begin, even within yourself, to lose respect. You lose your independence. You count on your ability to manipulate others. You become a parasite on other people that are deludable. And that is a dangerous place to be in.
This is another chance for me to plug the greatest show on TV right now, Better Call Saul, because these characters love doing pranks on people. They do get away with their schemes sometimes, but it always comes back, and they can never quite escape it. It's a great illustration of the virtue of honesty.
I've not seen it. That's a good recommendation then. Top of 272. This dishonest person is preying on the unconsciousness of fools. Such a man is a fool whose source of values is the fools that he succeeds in fooling. Can such a man be productive? Not really, not if that's the mode of operation. Can he have integrity? Can he have self-confidence, happiness, pride? The breach of honesty is going to lead to a lack of these other things as well. Virtue, as Socrates held, is one, to cheat on any of its aspects is to cheat on them all. Now, conventional moralists regard honesty as a trade-off. So notice the difference between Rand's view versus the conventional approach where, sure, yeah, we could obtain intrinsic values by fraud. It might be a real value to steal this $1 million or something like that. And so then when you decide whether you're going to do this act of fraud, you say, well, let's do a pros and cons. The pros are that you get the money, but the cons are that now there's the danger of you getting caught. So now let's just figure it out and let's do a risk-reward calculation. That's because they have this intrinsic view of value, that it's a thing that's valuable out of context. Peikoff writes that such an approach ignores the role of evaluation in the facts of reality. It ignores man's life and the rules that it requires. These moralists advise the impossible. They want one to weigh the long-range consequences of competing actions without reference to any objective ethical standard or principle. So it's pragmatism. Objectivism rejects this idea of calculating the trade-offs. If you are asking if something is valuable out of context, there's no answer to that question in objectivism. That's an unanswerable question. You're only courting destruction. Now, Peikoff favorably quotes Jesus here. What shall it profit a man if he gain the whole world and lose his soul? And he says that's admirably exact. And he points out the integrity of man's consciousness. Its principled harmony with existence is the precondition of man benefiting from any of the splendor the world holds out to him. Irrational action detaches a goal from the realm of evaluation. That's an interesting point. How can taking something out of context just detach it from evaluation? If you think about it, you'll start to figure out why that is true. Now, on this next section, he says we're often told that someone's noble ideal can be obtained only by evil actions. So translate this principle that you can't have this intrinsic out of context value, translate this over into the political realm, where they say if you want to make an omelet, you're going to have to break a few eggs. They say that the means justify the ends, that the triumph of the proletariat over the march of history is going to require that perhaps 10,000 or 10 million people be murdered. That idea of values out of context for the sake of something else cannot be true, according to objectivism. You cannot say that the end justifies the means. And Peikoff writes, objectivism rejects this license to immorality. So if you have an immoral means, that will invalidate the ends as well. Peikoff writes this, the end in itself, man's life, determines the fundamental means of human action, the proper principles. These in turn delimit the concretes that one can validly pursue in a given context. The ultimate value sets the virtues, which then guide men in the assessment of any particular object proposed as the goal. So he writes, conventional moralists usually regard honesty as a form of altruism. They regard it as selfless renunciation of all the values that one could have obtained by preying on the naivete of one's fellows. That's not true within objectivism. Sort of a new section here. He says the ethical status of a lie is not affected by the identity of its intended beneficiary. So no white lies. You don't do any service to anybody by becoming an accomplice in their blindness. That's not to say that you have to be harsh, but don't hide the truth for the sake of somebody's feelings. Now, another section here, he asks, okay, well, what about exceptions to telling the truth to people? Is honesty an absolute, and what does that mean? He says, just as particular objects must be evaluated in relation to moral principles, so moral principles themselves must be defined in relation to the facts that make them necessary. What facts of reality give rise to the need for honesty? Moral principles are guides to life-sustaining action that apply within a certain framework of conditions. They are absolutes contextually, which is an idea that we've discussed in the past. What facts of reality give rise to the need for you to tell the Nazi where you're hiding the Jewish children? There are no facts of reality that give rise to the need for that. He says virtues presuppose the processes of human growth and education. They cannot be invoked out of context. A man is obliged to practice what he preaches when he has the political freedom to do it, but he has no obligation to preach or practice any idea that would invite the attention, say, of the Gestapo or the IRS. The principle here has been understood by Christians and by philosophers for ages, and that is that in war or in a situation where a crime is being committed, you do not have an obligation to tell the truth. There are exceptions to how honesty should be applied. And this doesn't mean that it's not a moral principle or an absolute moral principle. It means that there are exceptions in how it is applied. I mean, even in playing basketball, if you're in a basketball team, are you allowed to be deceptive? Yes, you should not telegraph where you're going to throw the ball because it's a competition and that's the rules of the game. Every setting in human activity has its own context, and that determines whether or not you're allowed to deceive in that context. There will be other examples. They'll mention, like, for example, if somebody has a very significant illness, and if you were to tell them how significant it is, and you knew that that would make them lose hope and that that would actually increase the chances of dying, then it could be moral to not notify the person of their diagnosis and to tell them that it's different than it actually is. These are the kinds of situations that are just edge cases, but we have to have a way of understanding them, and I think Objectivism offers that. Likewise with the Hebrew midwives, that whole situation.
Free speech is an absolute. But yeah, there are things that you still shouldn't be allowed to say legally. Isn't that a contradiction? No. The things that are free speech should never be infringed. But there are some things that fall out of that principle. So same with the Nazi who asks you, do you have any Jews in your basement? There are people, I can think of one on Facebook who said, it is a violation of the 9th commandment if you say, no, there are no Jews in my basement. And I wonder if they've read the same Bible that I've read.
Well, they don't seem to be able to account for the Hebrew midwives, but they also don't seem to even know what the 9th commandment says. Do not bear false witness against your neighbor. Everybody thinks the 9th commandment is do not lie, but it's actually do not bear false witness. I mean, honesty is part of God's character. Truthfulness is part of God's character, and we seek to be like him in that. Even Jesus, when he was on the road to Emmaus, he went on as if he was going to keep walking, although he knew that he was going to have dinner with those 2 disciples. Even Jesus didn't tell his own brothers when he was going to Jerusalem. He let them come to their own conclusions. That's not to say that he was being dishonest. He allowed them to not know the truth because there was no need for them to know it and because it would put them in danger. And there's other situations like that in the Bible. David feigning that he was insane. Probably some others as well. Rahab lying directly to the security guys. Lying is absolutely wrong under certain conditions. It is wrong when a man does it in an attempt to obtain a value. So that's the principle here is, are you lying to obtain a value? Now, lying to protect your values from criminals is not wrong. From kidnappers, wielders of force. In which case, you should lie. You should lie proudly. So morally, the con man and the lying child protector are opposites. The difference is that between murder and self-defense. You cannot use force to murder somebody. You should use force to defend yourself. Likewise with something like telling a lie. It has a context in which it is appropriate. Summarizing, and we're just at the end of this reading, virtue does not consist in obeying concrete bound rules like do not lie, do not kill, do not accept help from others, make money, honor your parents, etc. That seems to be a snipe at Christianity where we have the 10 Commandments, but as you can see from our previous discussions building up to this, we don't think as Christians that the 10 Commandments are concrete bound rules out of context. We don't think that they are simply just so commands. We think that they are principles for how to live your life. The specific application of each of those needs to be made within the context of a human being who has an active mind. What does it mean to honor your father and mother as a child versus as an adult? The statement of the 10 Commandments doesn't say that. It expects that we would be able to reason through what that means. Likewise with, say, coveting or any of the other commands. Murder. It doesn't say in that 6th commandment, do not murder. It doesn't say what constitutes murder and what doesn't. The implication there is that you must use your reasoning mind to determine what constitutes it and what doesn't. For example, there are exceptions for war, which have always been understood. So Peikoff writes, the proper approach is to recognize that virtues are broad abstractions which one must apply to concrete situations by a process of thought, which is exactly what Christianity has always held, except for the most narrow biblicists. In this process, you must observe all the rules of correct epistemology, including definition by essentials and context keeping. So here we see that philosophy has a lot to offer Christianity, especially if you're coming to the Bible and you're thinking, I just want to accept everything that it says, but you don't have this connection to your intellectual forebearers, to people like John Calvin or others that have reasoned through these issues and done so from the point of view of an educated person, a person who understands the way the law works, who understands science, who understands philosophy in some level. Ayn Rand just comes out of the blue, even though she's not a Christian. She comes and she looks at these things and she figures it out. She figures it out because she's paid attention to logic. And any Christian through the centuries should have done the same, and many have. I appreciate what she said here and what Leonard Peikoff has said here. I appreciate it because it summarizes the issue in a systematized way, and it lays out what the questions are, and it provides us the clue to the answers. We may not always agree with the answers that the objectivists are coming up with. There is no doubt in my mind that the approach to truth that they are following, observe, ask yourself what facts of reality give rise to the need for these facts or principles or moral principles. That approach is the approach that Christians need to be following and that we should see more of within the church. It's been a disastrous week this week for the Southern Baptists, and in a lot of ways it's been a disaster for the United States if you look at what's going on politically. And I could probably say that same thing every week, but this week perhaps in particular. I want you to raise your eyes to moral ideals. Raise your eyes to the fact that we as Christians, regardless of what other choices other people are making, we can be moral in who we choose to associate with, in what we work for. We can be moral, we can be honest, we can have integrity, we can have rationality in how we live our lives, and nothing is going to stop us from doing those things. That's the wonderful thing about morality. Unlike some of the conventional moralists, we do not believe that virtue is its own reward. We believe that life is the reward of virtue, and that man's life as the kind of person that we were made to be, that God made us to be, is the reward of virtue. And we can choose virtue. No one can take that away from us. Unlike Rand, we have an eternal hope, which makes us so much better off than she is. But we have this hope because we are oriented toward reality. And that is what I want to encourage you to do this week, what I want to encourage you to advocate for in your church, in your social circles. Well, thank you for joining us this week. I'll look forward to future discussions. Everything is at christianintellectual.com/objectivism. I hope you have a good week. God bless.